When I got home, I heard unfamiliar voices coming from the basement. I listened carefully and heard my husband talking to a woman. "Hey, can we be together until late tonight?" "Yeah. My wife is out until tonight, so relax. Let's enjoy our time together slowly." My husband was talking in a mushy voice. He was cheating on me without my knowing. Blood rushed to my head, and I wanted to rush in right away, but I calmed down. Even if I went now, I would only catch them in the act. I planned to make them taste hell. My name is Kate Miller. I'm currently 40 and working as an office clerk for a stationery manufacturer. I married my husband, Keith, 5 years ago, but we promised to live together as a childless couple due to our age. Since then, we've been living together happily, but lately, we've stopped seeing each other as members of the opposite sex. Before, I used to be embarrassed to show my face without makeup in front of Keith, but as the years went by, I became able to walk around without any shame. Keith, like me, got used to it, and although he used to exercise if he gained even a little weight because he didn't want to be thought of as sloppy, he eventually stopped caring about his appearance. Now, he has a beer belly and fat resting above his belt. "You've gained weight recently. Shouldn't you exercise for your health?" "Huh? Oh, yeah. I will sometime." Keith was lying on the sofa, engrossed in his cell phone. He often gave me half-hearted answers when I spoke to him. Were we both going to forget about caring for each other and grow old in this degenerate life? I wondered. Then one day, Keith suddenly became interested in fashion. On his day off, he bought a bunch of clothes and put on a fashion show in front of the mirror. He was in a good mood, even humming a tune. I thought it was strange to see Keith so happy. I was suspicious of him suddenly becoming interested in fashion, so I asked. "You used to say cheap clothes were enough. What's changed?" Noticing me, Keith answered while folding the clothes he had spread out. "Oh, I just thought I should take care of my appearance now that I'm getting older." With that, Keith took his clothes to his room. I was strangely happy that Keith had become fashionable. It reminded me of how cool Keith was before we got married. I thought I'd follow Keith's lead and buy some nice makeup to make him fall in love with me again. It felt like we were back in our newlywed days, and I made dinner a little more luxurious. Keith also seemed happy when he saw my appearance and the food, and he asked, "What's today? Is it some kind of anniversary?" "No. You became fashionable, and it reminded me of our early days, so I got a little carried away," I said, blushing, and Keith smiled happily. "Oh, is that it? I'm happy to have such a lavish dinner for the first time in a while. Let's eat." Keith ate heartily and finished everything. I was glad I had made the effort to cook, watching him eat. The next day, a colleague called out to me at work. "Mrs. Miller, I saw your husband outside yesterday, and he seemed to be having a great time walking around." Mrs. Young, my coworker, nudged my arm and said with a grin, "Did you see? He woke up to fashion recently, and he bought a ton of clothes yesterday, so I was surprised," I said, and Mrs. Young's eyes widened. "Eh? Didn't you go shopping with him?" "No, I was home yesterday." I denied it, and I felt something was off. Mrs. Young then told me what she remembered seeing yesterday. "I'm sure I saw someone yesterday at noon who looked just like Mrs. Yu, with the same height and build, and similar hairstyle and clothes, next to your husband. But I only saw them inside a store, so it might have been a store clerk." Mrs. Young said that, thinking it was a misunderstanding on her part. I was a bit flustered, but I thought it was definitely a store clerk. Keith wouldn't do something like that, I thought. "It must have been a store clerk. Don't scare me like that first thing in the morning. You woke me up all at once." I brushed off Mrs. Young's misunderstanding by laughing it off. I was chatting with Mrs. Young until work started when I got an email. It was about the possibility of participating in next month's company trip. I marked my participation and promised to go with Mrs. Young. Then it became evening as I was working, and I went home after stopping by the supermarket. When I entered the room, Keith was in the kitchen, rustling around. Since he never cooks even when he comes home earlier than me, I was suspicious. "I'm home. What are you doing?" When I called out, Keith was a little surprised, but soon moved away from the kitchen. "Oh, welcome back. I was just thirsty, so I was looking for some tea," Keith explained, but he was searching in the spice rack where there should have been neither a cup nor tea. "That's the spice rack. You know that the tea is in the fridge, don't you? I said, as I took out the tea and handed it to Keith. I was astonished at Keith, who didn't even know where the tea was. Keith took it with a laugh as if it were someone else's business, and slouched around in the living room. I cooked dinner for Keith like that, and while eating together, I talked about what happened at the company today. Speaking of which, I'm going on a company trip next month. I'll also finish shopping for the trip with my colleague Mrs. Young next Saturday. Oh, got it. Have fun. Then, I remembered the story that Mrs. Young saw Keith. Oh. Speaking of which, Mrs. Young saw you yesterday. She thought we were on a date because someone who looked like me was next to you. She saw you in a clothing store, but you were the salesperson, right? I said, looking cautiously at Keith. Keith also nodded and spoke. Yeah. I had the salesperson put together a coordination that suited me. I requested clothes that wouldn't look strange next to you since the salesperson looked just like you. I was delighted by Keith's words, thinking of me. Since I thought we were going to live together like family, with no more dates, I got excited about being able to date, holding hands like when we were newlyweds. I completely forgot my uneasy feelings about Keith and finished eating happily. And for a few weeks, I spent peaceful days until it became Friday night. I'll go shopping for the trip with Mrs. Young tomorrow. I'll probably eat dinner too, so I might not get back until after 11 p.m. When I told Keith that I was going out tomorrow, he closed his phone and asked. Got it. Have fun. Where are you gonna be, by the way? I think I'll be at the big department store 3 stations away. All right. Don't worry about the time, just enjoy yourself. If it gets late, I'll come and pick you up. Keith was worried about me coming back. Recently, Keith has been worryingly kind and caring, and I thanked him with a not entirely displeased tone. Saturday morning came, and I went out early. I wanted to buy my summer clothes before meeting Mrs. Young. I spent a lot of time trying on clothes, and I didn't want to bother Mrs. Young, so I went early to choose and buy them alone. I ended up with more bags than planned, and I still had 2 hours left before Mrs. Young would arrive. I looked for a locker to leave my bags in, but there were no vacancies. I had plenty of time, so I thought I'd go home and drop it off. As I was walking down the street near my home, I saw a woman wearing a dress from my favorite brand. It was the very dress I had been wondering whether to buy. Her hairstyle and figure were similar to mine, and as I was watching, thinking I might buy it, the woman stopped right in front of my house. At that moment, I hid behind a utility pole to watch without being seen. As expected, Keith opened the front door and, after looking around, beckoned the woman into the house. Suspicion growing, I decided not to enter through the front door and quietly entered through the kitchen's back door. Then I heard the voices of Keith and the woman from the living room. Can we be together until tonight? Yeah. My wife is going out to have dinner with her friends, so we can spend time together until around 10 p.m. Keith reassured the woman, saying that I wouldn't be there until night. I'm so happy. Last time you left just after shopping, and I was lonely. Sorry. That day my wife was at home, and I would have looked suspicious if I'd been out late. I could hear Keith's voice, responding sweetly to the woman's cutesy tone. I felt a chill in that moment. I realized that the person Mrs. Young saw last time wasn't a store clerk, but this mistress. The thought that Keith had been taking such care with his appearance for this woman made me angry. Hey, did you look for the spices? If you didn't, I can't make a delicious meal, you know? I looked for them last time. I'll show you while I still remember. With that, their voices grew closer and closer. I was supposed to leave the clothes and leave, but I feared being discovered and instead went out with the bags. I managed to leave the house just in time, without making a sound. I put the bags in the outdoor shed and left the house in frustration, feeling like crying. As I walked, I wondered how long Keith had been cheating. Thinking that all the efforts Keith had made for me recently were actually for that woman made me furious. Feeling irritated, I met up with Mrs. Young. Even while shopping, I couldn't help but wonder when the two of them had started cheating, and who the mistress was. Determined to make him confess, I came up with a plan. After dinner with Mrs. Young, I returned home around 10 p.m. He was lounging around the house as if nothing had happened. Welcome back. Did you have fun? Keith was behaving so naturally that I thought what I had seen at noon might have been a dream. Yes, I had a wonderful time. I responded to his lie with a lie of my own. I wouldn't be satisfied unless I trapped him in a way that he couldn't talk his way out of. I thought so, and kept Keith in the dark until my plan was perfect. Of course, during that time, I diligently collected evidence like photographs and recorded phone calls. 3 weeks went by, and I was looking forward to the company trip this weekend. By the way, isn't the company trip coming up soon? When does it start and end? Keith asked with a worried look in his eyes, but I knew he was probably planning to bring that woman over. I answered with a look of concern. It's from Friday morning until Sunday night. Keith, can you manage to cook and all? You might want to order takeout. Yeah. I'll try not to make a mess. I'll miss you, but enjoy your time with your colleagues. I'm sure that at that moment, Keith was secretly celebrating the opportunity to spend time with his mistress. I hoped he would keep playing into my hands without suspecting anything. And then Friday came, and it was the day of the company trip. I was planning to leave the house at 10 a.m., and Keith was leaving for work at 8 a.m., so I would leave later. I took advantage of that time to carry out my plan. After Keith left, I immediately opened his room. I intentionally spilled perfume, filling the room with the scent. Then, I quickly sent Keith an email, telling him that I'd accidentally spilled perfume while cleaning his room, and asking him to sleep in the basement from today until Sunday. Keith's room had an inside lock, but the basement had an outside lock. I had utilized the mechanism of the locks. Since I received a reply from Keith agreeing to use the basement, everything seemed to be going according to plan. I looked at Keith's email and then headed straight for the company trip. During the trip, I couldn't relax. My mind was consumed with thoughts of Keith and his mistress, and I found it hard to enjoy myself. Hey, Mrs. Miller. You look pale and you're sweating a lot. I'll tell the boss, why don't you take a break? Mrs. Young, who had been walking with me, looked quite concerned about my condition. I'm sorry, even though I promised to walk with you. I feel sick, so I'm going to leave early. Don't worry about it. The boss was walking over there, so I'll go get him. Mrs. Young ran to the boss and called him over. When the boss saw my condition, he was very concerned and asked if I was feeling unwell. Go back to the hotel or have your husband come and pick you up. He told me. If Keith came to pick me up, our planned scheme would fail, so I decided to return to the hotel and leave early in the morning. Keith would never think I'd come back on Saturday morning when I said I'd return on Sunday night. I was so excited to imagine Keith's panic-stricken look. When morning came, I apologized to Mrs. Young and my boss and decided to head home early. I took connecting trains and arrived at my nearest station at 9 in the morning. Hoping that Keith and his mistress were still fast asleep, I hurried home. The moment I opened the key to my house, I was sweating so much that it didn't feel like I was opening my own door. With a tension that made me feel like I couldn't make a sound, my heartbeat kept rising. Just when I was going to go to the basement and quietly lock the door, I heard a voice. Keith, wake up. It's already 9 in the morning. I'm hungry, let's eat breakfast. The mistress had woken up. I was so surprised at the voice that I slipped the luggage I was holding and made a loud noise. I was sweating and panicking, but I decided to change my plan instantly. I'm home. I loudly announced my arrival to Keith. The two were silent and still. They probably didn't expect me to come back, and they must be panicking. After that, I continued to walk around the living room, making loud noises, and putting away the luggage from the trip. The two were probably stuck in a situation where they couldn't get out. Then I said loudly, Huh? Is Keith out? I pretended to look for Keith. Oh. He might be sleeping in the basement. I said it loudly and slowly approached the basement. I heard a small noise from the basement as if they were desperately looking for a hiding place, and I couldn't help but chuckle. Then I flung the basement door open. Huh? He's not here. Maybe he went out, I said and sharply closed the basement door. At the same time, I casually locked it. The two probably haven't realized the seriousness of being locked in, feeling relieved that they've managed to hide safely. I turned on the TV and listened with the volume up a bit. The weather forecaster reported that today was going to be a hot and humid summer day. I turned on the air conditioner in the living room and enjoyed myself in the cool room. On the other hand, the basement was almost like a storeroom, with no air conditioner or fan. I smiled smugly, wondering how long they could endure. An hour passed. Keith and the woman were still holding on, waiting for me to go somewhere. I looked out the window. The sun was shining, and it was a scorching heat. I vowed not to go outside, so as not to give Keith a chance. As I comfortably watched TV and ate snacks, another hour passed. Then, as if they had reached their limit, I heard Keith's voice. "Hey! Open up!" I sighed and headed to the basement. When I opened the key, a stuffy air flowed from the basement. "It's hot, give me water." Keith went to the living room, sweating and looking exhausted. I peeked into the basement, but the woman was not there, apparently still hiding. Keith drained the water and started yelling at me. "You said I could use the basement. Why did you lock it?" Keith showered me with curses. I apologized sincerely but said a little word to shake Keith. "I'm sorry. But when I checked the room, nobody was there." "Where were you, Keith?" Keith couldn't possibly admit that he was hiding in the closet with a woman, so he blabbered on, raising his voice to cover it up. "So, what does it matter? It's hot, it's hot." With that, Keith took a bottle of water in hand and went back down to the basement. I figured he must have gone to give the water to the woman hiding there. 5 minutes later, Keith still hadn't returned and commanded me as follows. "I feel like I'm gonna faint from the heat. Go buy some ice cream right now." Keith spoke to me condescendingly, pointing his finger. "There's ice cream in the fridge, you know." I saw right through Keith's naive strategy. I had anticipated what Keith was likely to say, and I was prepared. "Today, let's have pancakes." "Yes, pancakes." "You don't have the ingredients, do you?" "Go to the supermarket and buy them right now." "Oh, coincidentally, I was planning to make pancakes today. I have all the ingredients, so there's no need to go shopping today." Keith was trying in some way to get me out of the house. I was desperate not to laugh at Keith as he thought frantically. I finally decided to take drastic action, fearing that if he said anything more, it would be something I hadn't anticipated. "The smell of perfume must have already disappeared from your room, and you don't need to use the basement. Shall we clean the basement?" As I tried to go to the basement, Keith stopped me in a panic. "I'll clean it, so it's okay." "You've never cleaned anything before, have you?" Even though I said that, Keith was desperate to stop me. "I feel like cleaning. Leave it to me." He forcibly took the cleaning tools, so I stared at him and said, "Then clean your own room instead of the basement. You've never even cleaned your own room before. Start with that, not the basement." Keith was momentarily taken aback by the irrefutable words. I took advantage of the opportunity, hurriedly went down to the basement, and opened the door. The woman was sitting in the middle of the basement room, perhaps because the closet was too hot. The moment our eyes met, her face turned pale. "Who are you?" Of course, I knew she was his mistress, but I pretended not to know. Keith and the woman thought it was their chance, so they lied. "This lady is my boss at work. I forgot to bring home some important documents, and she brought them to me." Yes, that's right. I'm Keith's boss. I'm here to help." Keith thought he had cleverly lied his way out of the situation. The woman also clumsily tried to stick to the lie, desperate to maintain the story. It was too sloppy, and I almost laughed. "Really? Your boss comes to deliver them on a weekend morning? Normally, wouldn't you go and pick them up?" I said that, and Keith started to sweat. Furthermore, I confronted Keith. "Besides, if she's just delivering something, she doesn't have to come into the room, right? Even if you wanted to offer her a tea as thanks, you'd lead her to the living room, wouldn't you? It's strange to bring your boss into a room without air conditioning." Keith seemed to regret the lie he had made on the spot. But it's too late to regret now. The woman also just turned blue and hung her head. Since Keith and the woman were just silent, I brought up the subject. "You're not his boss, are you? You're his lover, right?" When I said that, Keith's shoulders twitched. It was as if he was admitting it. "I'm sorry I lied. But really, this is the first time I've done something like this. Please believe me in that." Keith tried to explain. The woman also nodded in agreement with Keith. I'm not going to fall for such a makeshift excuse. "So, the woman who was visiting our house last time was someone else?" I said, and Keith let out a loud exclamation in alarm. "Did you think you could fool me? I've got evidence of you bringing her here again and again, and all those phone calls. I've got proof." With that, I handed Keith the business card of the divorce lawyer I had gotten. The woman looked pale throughout the ordeal. Keith was very persistent, and I couldn't refuse him. What? You were the one coming on to me, saying you're better than my wife. What are you playing the victim for? When Keith shouted angrily, the woman fought back. I am the victim. Telling me to dress and style my hair like your wife, so your wife and neighbors wouldn't find out. You're so selfish. The woman was also yelling, emotions raw. I stopped their quarreling with a single sentence. The real victim here is me. With that, their argument came to an abrupt halt. I quickly got the woman's address and contact information and sent her home for the day. She played the victim card right to the end. Once alone with me, Keith looked awkward and kept his eyes down. Can you please leave right away? I think the lawyer will be contacting you about the division of assets. After that, Keith left with only his essentials. He's probably going to his parents' house. I had expected this, so the moment Keith left, I called his parents. Mr. Miller, I'm sorry to call so suddenly. Can I talk to you for a bit? I told his parents that Keith's infidelity had caused us to divorce, and they were quite angry. They apologized to me and promised to kick him out even if he came back home. Keith moved exactly as I had predicted. He apparently tried to lie and stay with his parents. I'm home. We're doing some renovations at the house. Kate went to stay at her parents', so let me stay here too. He shamelessly tried to stay with this lie, but his parents, having heard everything from me, lectured Keith and kicked him out. Keith will be staying in a hotel for a while, and I'm sure his money will run out soon. As I imagined Keith feeling uncomfortable as his address changes and rumors spread after the divorce, I found it funny and couldn't help laughing. I was delighted thinking about Keith's future miserable life. And the woman he cheated with will also be served with a claim for damages for emotional distress, so a few days later, the woman came to my house. Her parents were standing behind her. They said that she wasn't working and couldn't pay the claim, so she had turned to her parents. And her parents, feeling terribly sorry, wanted to apologize in person. The sight of the three of them apologizing at my front door was quite ridiculous. I told the cheating woman this. You can take years if you need to, but you must pay back the money you earn yourself. Don't rely on your parents at all. With that, the woman, who seemed intent on relying on her parents, looked fearful, almost crying. No matter how much she resisted, I couldn't sympathize with her. I thought it served her right. After a while, I received payment from Keith and the woman. I sold the house we were living in and moved to an apartment for one person. I'd never lived alone before, so I was anxious, but it turned out to be comfortable. I didn't want to give up on love because of what happened, so I'm going to start looking for a new relationship. I'm still anxious about falling in love again, but I think I can forget about my ex-husband entirely by finding new love. I've decided to live a life without regret.